Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from Commander Legends Archelos Lagoon Mystic. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to both down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Archelos is a 2/4 turtle shaman for 1 generic, 1 black, 1 green, and 1 blue. As long as he's untapped, all other permanents enter the battlefield untapped. This is essentially a global Amulet of Vigor effect. Naturally, the deck is built around this effect, so it will always benefit us more than opponents who might only get sporadically benefited from it. However, if Archelos is tapped, then all other permanents enter the battlefield tapped. Thus, if we're able to control whether Archelos is upright or sideways, we can have all of our permanents enter untapped while having our opponents enter tapped. This is such an amazing ability and thus makes Archelos an incredibly versatile deck. Therefore, it bears repeating that this deck is only how I would run Archelos, which is making the most of his ability to stall the board, accelerate ours, and win by comboing off. First, let's start with slowing down our opponent's game. Unfortunately, Archelos has a humble backside, so we can't always send him off to combat. Fortunately, we can tap him down with cards like Survivor's Encampment, Holdout Settlement, Springleaf Drum, Cerulean Caretaker, Loam Dryad, and Cryptolith Rite. Notice how none of these effects require mana to activate, yet all provide a mana. The Encampment and Settlement are on a land that generates mana, so they don't really take up a slot in the deck. The Drum and the Dryads only cost 1 to cast, so they're great 1-drops. Notice also that these 5 cards don't care if Archelos has Summoning Sickness, so we're able to tap him down the same turn we play him in order to never give opponents any benefit. Unfortunately, Cryptolith Rite gives the ability to Archelos, so he'd need to tap down on his own, and thus doesn't bypass Summoning Sickness. Since it gives this to all creatures, we can tap them all for mana for when we're bouncing and sacrificing lands, but we'll see those nefarious interactions later on. I had mentioned tapping Archelos down to attack in the combat phase, but on his own, he's just not going to cut it. So if push comes to shove, Whispersilk Cloak not only gives Archelos Shroud, but it also makes him unblockable. That means we could attack without worrying about him getting blocked and thus killed in combat. Although this deck does generate a ton of mana, so having to recast him multiple times in a game isn't a big deal. However, we do want him out as often as possible because of his Amulet of Vigor effect. Mutating Broko's Apex of Forever and or Otrimi the Ever Playful onto Archelos also helps him out in the attack department. Either of these makes Archelos a 6/6 Trampler, which should help him survive attacking somewhere on the board. It also makes him a decent enough clock for when we're slowed down everyone else's games or soft lock them out, but we'll see that soon enough. So attacking is also a good way to tap down Archelos. Alright, now how are we going to benefit from Archelos' effect? Curiously enough, with some lands that are suboptimal in most other decks. The deck's running all 4 Ravnica and Bounce lands. Granted, these require us to return a land to our hand, but this is a Landfall deck after all, and it could drop a ton of lands at once. So this is actually a bonus for us in this deck. I'm not running any of the Karoo lands because those are more restrictive. That being said, we can return a tapped land to our hand and then have a land that taps for 2 mana when it enters the battlefield thanks to Archelos. Similarly, Svelunite Temple, Havenwood Battleground, and Ebon Stronghold are also included. Now, these need to be tapped and sacrificed to generate 2 mana, but there's a lot of synergy in the deck with sacrificing lands, plus we can play lands from the graveyard. Thus, we're able to replay these lands from the graveyard multiple times in a turn, and each time untapped, thus generating a ton of mana. Lotus Field requires sacrificing 2 lands when it enters the battlefield, but those lands can be tapped so we can make the most of it. It also taps down for a whopping 3 mana of any one color, and it has hexproof. This land is beast in this deck. This can give us at least 5 mana by turn 3, just in lands. Archelos also makes the slow fetches like Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse good since the fetch land would enter untapped. These are even more amazing here due to the graveyard recursion we're going to see in a bit. Same with Prismatic Vista and Fabled Passage, which are the other 2 fetch lands in the deck. The Vista will always get us an untapped basic, but that's not always the case with the Passage. In any case, not only can we replay these fetches from the graveyard, but they're also amazing at triggering the multiple landfall effects in the deck. Similarly, Thawing Glaciers is crazy good here. Not only will it enter untapped, but the basic it ramps for will as well. It returns to our hand at the beginning of the next cleanup step, but we can just replay it again during our next turn. This also helps trigger landfall multiple times in a turn. Then, Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth lets them tap down for mana when there's nothing left to tutor for, or if we need to tap them for mana in case they won't be able to fetch up or ramp for an untapped land if Archelos is offline. Besides these, Archelos also helps Tolaria West enter untapped in case we need it for mana, more so than as a land tutor. In any case, the best land to tutor for is definitely Thawing Glacier, so if you really want to get those landfall triggers, go for that first. If not, there are plenty of other utility lands in the deck to tutor for, depending on the case. For example, tutoring for Urborg might come in handy for one of the win cons we're going to see further along in the video. I mentioned that thanks to Archelos being an Amulet of Vigor in the command zone, this can lead to a very strong Landfall deck. That's because most ramp effects have the lands enter the battlefield tapped, and lands that can tap for a lot of mana enter the battlefield tapped as well. In order to make even more out of these effects, the deck aims to be able to play as many lands as possible during a turn. This is why the deck is running Azusa Lost Seeking, Wayward Swordtooth, Exploration, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, AEC Tyrant of Gaia Strait, and the Gitrog Monster. These all allow us to play an additional land per turn with the exception of Azusa, who lets us play 2 lands instead. The Dryad has the added bonus of allowing to tap down our lands for any color of mana. Unfortunately, it does not make double mana lands tap down for 2 mana of any color. It just provides an effect similar to Chromatic Lantern. AAC takes it a step further by also drawing us a card with its Landfall trigger, which is completely busted in this deck, and that's not the only Landfall effect that draws us cards either, but we'll see those later. The Gitrog Monster is an amazing engine with what I mentioned earlier with sacrificing lands. This allows for some insane interactions in the deck. Cracking a fetch will draw us a card. Sacrificing any of the Fallen Empire's lands will also draw us a card, etc. Even more so with Scapeshift. This sorcery is so stupidly powerful in this deck, it's always a joy when it resolves. Not only do we get a bunch of lands we already used into the graveyard, but we're going to get that same amount onto the battlefield from our library. Not only will this trigger landfall effects a ridiculous amount of times, but thanks to Archelos, they enter the battlefield untapped. Super broken. We can then play lands from our graveyard with Crucible of Worlds, Ramunap Excavator, and Ancient Green Warden. It might seem excessive to run all 3, but removal is a thing and playing lands from our graveyard is such a powerful engine. With the Gitrog Monster out, we're drawing a ton of cards, but they're also going to help us trigger Landfall a bunch of times since we're going to be able to play lands from the graveyard. That way we always get our Landfall triggers. Speaking of which, Ancient Green Warden also doubles our Landfall triggers, so anything that would trigger due to a land entering the battlefield triggers twice. Same with Yarok the Desecrated, which is also in the deck. Yarok not only doubles the enter the battlefield triggers of permanents entering the battlefield, but it will also double our Landfall triggers, which is utterly busted in this deck. The deck also has Splendid Reclamation, which gets all lands in our graveyard back onto the battlefield. Along with Scapeshift, these are the 2 most powerful sorceries in the deck. Resolving Splendid Reclamation after Scapeshift is euphoric. And thanks to Archelos, those lands enter the battlefield untapped. So not only does this provide the potential of an insane amount of landfall triggers, but we can also use those lands to tap for even more mana and keep playing. Elvish Reclaimer is along the same vein of bustedness since it does both on its own. Its ability not only has us sacrificing a land, but we can ramp for any land with it as well. Notice that the sacrificed land doesn't have to be untapped, and the land we ramp will enter the battlefield untapped thanks to Archelos. Along with those previously mentioned cards that let us play additional lands per turn, Storm Cauldron, Girapur Orrery, and Rites of Flourishing are included. Granted, these also help out opponents, but keep in mind that Archelos is going to make those lands enter the battlefield tapped. It's also providing us with 3 additional lands to drop per turn. This is super important when you realize that Storm Cauldron can bounce back a ton of lands in a single turn. This can be incredibly backbreaking to opponents since they're more than likely not going to be getting 10 lands a turn onto the battlefield like we'll be. In fact, punish opponents even further thanks to Sire of Stagnation, Nightshade Harvester, and Polluted Bonds. The Eldrazi exiles the top 2 cards of their library for every land that enters the battlefield under their control. This will make them think twice not only of dropping multiple lands but doing so throughout a match due to Storm Cauldron. Not only for that, but because we also draw 2 cards from their landfall trigger. Same goes for Nightshade Harvester and Polluted Bonds. Their landfall trigger is from opponents' lands. If they're constantly bouncing and playing lands, these life loss effects will definitely add up, especially with Ancient Green Warden and Yarok on the battlefield. Even more oppressive than this is Confounding Conundrum, which is a soft lock with Storm Cauldron. If an opponent has more than 1 land enter the battlefield under their control, they have to bounce a land. So while Storm Cauldron, Girapur Orrery, and Rites of Flourishing allows the entire table to play additional lands, Confounding Conundrum turns that symmetric effect one-sided to only benefit us. With Storm Cauldron, it's going to be almost impossible for them to play lands since any land tapped for mana will get bounced and they can only really play 1 land per turn after that. So this is going to slow them down almost as badly as Stasis. If that weren't enough, Burgeoning benefits us even more for these effects. If we're bouncing lands to our hand or have lots of lands in our hand because of Storm Cauldron, then each time an opponent plays a land, we drop a land onto the battlefield. This is almost guaranteed if Storm Cauldron is out, so we can definitely get a ton of landfall triggers from this, as well as not being as affected by Storm Cauldron. Sunder is also included in the deck for good measure. This is 100% beneficial to us since we'll be able to replay almost all lands bounced this way, while opponents are going to have a very hard time recovering from it afterwards. Add to that the fact that it's an instant, meaning that we don't have to cast it in our own turn, and it's incredibly salt-inducing. Cyclonic Rift is also included in the deck, so being able to bounce all lands and all non-land permanents we don't control, on top of that, just might have you win the game by everyone scooping. Since their permanents are going to enter tapped thanks to Archelos, it's even more difficult to bounce back afterwards. And even if we have to discard a ton of those lands in our cleanup step, we can always just play them from the graveyard anyways, unlike our opponents who are going to lose most of their board state. Going back to the lands synergy, Ghost Town is another way to take advantage of these effects, and it works all on its own with Burgeoning, and even without it if we're really desperate for that landfall trigger. But if we do have Burgeoning, we can just bounce Ghost Town back to our hand in response to the Burgeoning trigger in order to have a land to get onto the battlefield with it. Besides Burgeoning, the deck's running Walking Atlas, Sakura Tribe Scout, and Llanowar Scout, which allows us to get a land onto the battlefield from our hand at instant speed and whenever we want. So while we're limited to how many lands we can literally play in our main phases, with these we can play even more lands or play them outside of our turn in order to get a surprise landfall trigger, which we're going to see in a bit. Farseek and 3 Visits are also included to ramp even harder. They're included not only because they are amazing acceleration in the very early game, but they're still good even in the late game, especially since the deck has plenty of basic lands and lands with basic types that they can ramp for. Since the deck doesn't have so many forests, running these 2 and not Nature's Lore was fine enough. 3 Visits is currently cheaper thanks to Commander Legends, so that's why I chose it of the 2. Finally, we're going to see just what these engines were built for, the landfall abilities. We already saw that ISC draws us a card with its landfall ability, and Sire of Stagnation draws us 2 cards when an opponent has a land enter the battlefield. But the deck also has Tatiova Benthic Druid, Nissa Vital Force, and, to a certain extent, Tireless Tracker. The tracker doesn't outright draw us a card, but it does create a clue token which we can then cash in for a 2-mana cantrip when needed. Nissa doesn't directly draw us a card, but she does via her emblem. This emblem is super easy to get out. She just has to survive one whole turn around the table. If that weren't enough, her +1 not only accelerates us further by untapping a land, but it becomes a 5/5 with haste until our next turn, so it can also serve to chump block to protect her. Excavation can also synergistically draw us cards, but not via landfall. Instead, we have to sacrifice a land, which is no problem whatsoever with this deck. In fact, this can create quite the advantage with the Gitrog monster in play as well. Our opponents can also use this ability, but I doubt they're going to want to when they have them locked. We can also draw cards conventionally with Stroke of Genius and Blue Sun Zenith. Either way, with all the mana this deck can generate, these are excellent mana sinks that can help us dig even deeper through our deck for our other combo pieces or win cons. Speaking of generating obscene amounts of mana, Lotus Cobra and Squandered Resources get the job done. The Cobra is just beyond amazing here, and I'm so grateful it's now rare instead of mythic, making it easier to get. The amount of mana this alone generates is ridiculous. The enchantment does something similar but with sacrificing lands. Again, something we might even prefer. With both out, we can get mana from the Cobra's landfall trigger, mana tapping the land, and then mana sacrificing the land. So even if that land tapped for just 1 mana, we can get 3 mana from it as well as fueling an engine. We can even bypass mana altogether with Nissa of Shadowed Boughs, albeit just for creatures. She gets a loyalty counter from her landfall trigger, so she can get a ton of counters in this deck. So not only can her ultimate help us get a creature onto the battlefield, she can do so from the graveyard too. So if any key creature bit the dust, she can just get it back no problem, since she's going to have so much loyalty anyways. If that weren't enough, her +1 also helps us accelerate by untapping a land. This land can also become a 3/3 which can help defend her. Speaking of defenses, we can also create a ton of bodies both for blocking and for alpha striking the entire table. Scoot Swarm, Rampaging Balos, and Zendarkar's Roll each create a token via landfall, the most broken of these obviously being Scoot Swarm. As long as we control 6 or more lands, it's going to create so many tokens that it's exponential. In case you haven't already known, these triggers are enough to crash Arena. In any case, if we're able to create a large enough board state that can survive until we can attack with them, it's pretty much game over or really close to that. Fortunately, we have plenty of ways of protecting our board state, but we'll see those soon. We can also build a menacing board state with our opponent's creatures thanks to Royal Elemental. It simultaneously gets us potential attackers while getting rid of potential blockers. It might seem a bit hard to cast with a triple blue, but it's not really an issue with how many lands we're playing and mana we're generating. However, the best way to create creatures in this deck is with Meloku the Clouded Mirror. Not only can he create a 1/1 flyer, but he does so by bouncing a land to our hand. So he can also help in maximizing our landfall triggers by returning lands to our hand and then be replayed when we run out of lands in our hand. This might not seem as powerful as straight up landfall token creation like Scoot Swarm, but Meloku is still slightly better simply because he can go infinite. How does it go infinite? With Retreat to Coral Helm and any of the creatures that can tap down to drop a land from our hand that we saw earlier. Let's take Sakura Tribe Scout as an example. You tap a land for mana to pay for Meloku's ability, then bounce that very land you just used. Then, you activate the Scout to get that land back onto the battlefield. This triggers the Retreat. You choose the mode that untaps a creature, untapping the Scout. You can now do this all over again. Not only will this generate infinite tokens, but infinite landfall triggers as well. If we have Lotus Cobra out, it will also generate infinite mana in any combination of colors. Which brings us to our less invasive but equally distressing combo-based win cons. So we can win either by overrunning the board with attackers, or we can drain the life, as well as the will to live, from our opponents with Ob Nixilis the Fallen, Dread Presence, and Retreat to Hagra. What's great about these effects is that we don't really need to go infinite to win with them. Yes, we win the moment we have these out with the Maloku combo, but the deck is getting so many lands onto the battlefield at any given moment that the life loss will definitely add up. Recall that the deck is running Urborg to move Yawgmoth, so all lands entering the battlefield will trigger Dread Presence. Keep in mind that you can also use this to draw cards at the cost of 1 life each trigger in a pinch. As a bonus, Ob Nixilis also gets bigger, potentially making him big enough to take out a hapless opponent. In any case, we can also win outright with Exsanguinate. With the amount of mana this set can generate, we can very easily win the game by sinking a ton of mana into it, and decidedly so if we generate infinite mana. Keep in mind that we can also sink infinite mana into Stroke of Genius and Blue Sun Zenith to deck an opponent if need be. As for protecting our board state, combos, etc., the deck's running Pact of Negation, Swan Song, Negate, and Counterspell for its suite of counter magic. You can run Mana Drain over Negate to make even more mana, but it's not that necessary since Negate is easier to cast and we're more worried about non-creature spells anyways. In any case, Beast Within and Assassin's Trophy can get rid of any permanent at instant speed. Assassin's Trophy is even more oppressive in this deck since the opponent may choose to not get the land due to all of the detrimental effects for them playing lands. The 3/3 Beast is no issue to us at all. Sylvan Safekeeper can help against spot removal by giving a creature Shroud. It even does it in the best way possible since it requires sacrificing a land with no investment in mana and can be done at instant speed. We can also give Hexproof to our entire board with Heroic Intervention. It also gives Indestructible, which is pretty significant in multiplayer games. If someone tries to wipe the board and we have this in our hand, they're actually doing us a favor since everyone else's board is going to be wiped out. Archelos also helps Mystic Sanctuary always enter the battlefield untapped regardless of how many islands we control or not. That way, you can keep it handy for when you need to top deck a response from your graveyard. As far as being fetched for, the deck only has the previously mentioned fetched lands which only get basics, but it is an island so it can be ramped for with Farseek. It can also be tutored for thanks to Talaria West, or it can just be kept in hand as a way to recover a spell without taking up a slot in the deck. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 3 Shock lands, all 3 Scry lands, Zagoth Triome, Command Tower, and Path of Ancestry, as well as 3 of each snow-covered basic land in case anyone's running anything that benefits us for it. The 3 Theros Temples are also great with Archelos out since they enter untapped and can still scry us 1. Path of Ancestry is also great since we can scry 1 whenever we use it to cast Archelos. And if he's already out, it'll enter untapped anyways. Recall that thanks to Archelos, we can run a much cheaper mana base and take advantage of the abilities of these lands as well as the ones mentioned in the beginning of the video. That being said, the Shock lands are still included as a way to still be able to enter untapped if need be at the cost of just 2 life, if we don't have Archelos out. In any case, you can still swap them out for even cheaper lands and the deck will still run just fine. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Archelos Lagoon Mystic. As I mentioned in the beginning, Archelos is a commander that can be built in so many different ways. This is one of those cases where personality and personal interests and philosophies play a role in how you build your deck. That being said, I chose to build a Landfall deck to take the most advantage out of his Amulet of Vigor effect while also taking advantage of slowing down opponents with his Frozen effect. So that's why there's that element of Stax and hate in the deck. So the deck aims to slow everyone down while maintaining a gross advantage in creature count, land count, and every other type of acceleration while also hurting opponents in the process. This allows for plenty of routes to victory so the deck isn't linear or at all or boring to pilot. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link, that also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of the Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby and happy brewing.